Hi. Hi, morning everybody. I see some new folks have joined us, and that's fantastic. And those of you who are rejoining us from yesterday, thank you for coming back. So what we have planned for today is picking up with two other topics, which I think are incredibly relevant and can really help provide that framework for our development of online courses and learning activities within all kinds of courses. And that's thinking skills and motivation. So especially for those of you who were here yesterday, let me just orient you to a couple ways that we're going to use our time here today. So what we have today is divided up a little bit differently than we did yesterday. So yesterday we took on the topics of memory and attention, which are so inherently interrelated that I treated them really together with our application and examples. So we have these two more or less discrete topics today. So we're going to take them on one after the other. For thinking, what I have planned for you is, once again, overview. There we go. So we'll have an overview of some of the really key principles, including some formal introduction to a couple of topics having to do with thinking. And we will have a demonstration. I have one in particular planned for you, and some other kinds of extended examples and illustrations of how these principles, I think, can play out in different kinds of situations, all intended to spark your creativity for what you're designing and gearing up this summer. And we do have an application exercise, similar, not identical to yesterday's, that's associated with thinking, and an opportunity to share those out today. So we'll do that. Now with motivation, I did compress this somewhat, so the examples and some of the overview are more or less together. So we'll take on the thinking, we'll take on motivation, mix it up a little bit with motivation, and end with a second opportunity to break out, apply, and share out. All right, so does that kind of give us a little bit of the lay of the land today? All right, great. I do want to give you a break as well. So probably, again, between 9:45 and 10, depending on the flow of what we're doing, we'll take about a 10-minute break. All right? Okay, so jumping in today with the topic of thinking. So as I characterized it yesterday, thinking skills are rightfully what we really prize and pursue the most as teachers in higher education. That's been my experience. That's the feedback I get from engaged faculty all over the country. This is really, really what we want. And though, as I also characterized it yesterday, this is one of the most challenging things. And it's very easy, especially given the challenge of teaching and developing these thinking skills, sophisticated thinking skills. It's very easy to have that really be crowded out by other concerns in the course. Most typically that would be a focus on content, right? Which content, what to include, how much can I possibly put in? So I would like to just really from the start encourage you to be thinking about that balance. So that's a theme that's going to crop up again and again with what I'm going to tell you about thinking. So with the study of thinking, so coming at this, just like as always, coming at this as a cognitive psychologist, here's how I would first off think about thinking. So it's a really, really broad topic, and that's fine. That's okay. We live with that within our field. So this can mean a very diverse array of skills or mental activities that students might be doing. So thinking can comprise the kind of formal reasoning that you would see in a philosophy or logic or mathematics class. It could be the problem solving that you see in a nursing class or an engineering class. That's of course thinking as well. The study of analogies, believe it or not, has been a rich area unto itself within the study of thinking. So how we take one problem or scenario that we know how to solve and we apply that or map it onto something else. So that's even its own area within thinking. And then the all-important critical thinking, which we will also return to as a separate topic as well. So it's a big, broad umbrella, right? And that's okay. It's always good to kind of be thinking about or gravitating towards a particular one or ones that you think are really relevant to you. But all these things are rightfully thinking. Now, if there's one big take-home message for those of us in higher learning. It's this, right? So out of the study of thinking, which has been going on systematically for decades, here's this one issue, and that is context specificity and transfer, all right? So seriously, whole books, good books, have been written just about this problem. One author characterizes this as the problem in education, is that of transfer. So we learn it in one context, and does it transfer over to the next one? Well, much like, as I threw out to you yesterday, that memories tend to be very context specific. It might pop up in one context and not another, just because you've shifted something. Thinking skills are even more so. So it's, even though we rightfully want our students to develop these really general thinking skills that apply everywhere, that's what we want, that's not what the human mind is really wired to do very well, okay? So what we're really more inclined or programmed to do as human beings is to think in a particular way in a particular context. And I say this in part because history of the study of thinking is littered with these really funny and kind of humbling studies of how you can kind of pull the rug out from underneath even very deep experts such as statisticians or surgeons who are used to making these incredible statistical and probability calculations in their professional context. You change up the situation a little bit and you can sometimes trick them into making the same kinds of reasoning errors that the rest of us untrained people do on a regular basis, all right? So thinking is very, very context specific. And so transfer of learning is almost always, I think, more challenging than we think it's going to be, all right? So if we think about this for a second, I think most of us can kind of go back in all of our memories of working with students, or even just things that have floated up generally in the teaching of our courses over the years, and see, yes, something didn't transfer, all right? You taught it to them in one context, and you wanted them to carry this out into the rest of their lives, and you are going to be very lucky if it carries into the next course or even the next module, all right? So let's start off the morning with some possibly bitter examples. Does anybody have any examples from their own teaching of you thought it was going to transfer, you taught it, you tweaked one thing, and what happened to it, right? And students are going, we didn't learn that. Anybody care to share? And we have our catch boxes at the ready. Yes.
Related to the idea of using library citations properly, I have my students go through a mini tutorial and quiz available from the library website, and I set up a quiz for them to go through APA style. And I was hoping it would transfer to their final project, and there was no sense that they had ever gone through that little tutorial or taken a quiz on the very things they were expected to do during the final project. So. Sure.
Well, this gets back
they were
to
separated.
putting an illustration in your stuff that I mentioned yesterday. Students putting illustrations into their papers required, and this gets done 7 times during the course, one right after another. And it's been totally amazing to me how some people get it right away, or maybe even they had previous training in it, and I'm still catching some people on the 7th lesson who haven't figured out what an intersection between 2 domains of a Venn diagram is.
Wow. And you're going, okay, teach this new thing to me. All right. Any other examples of where transfer might have fallen apart in your classes or teaching?
Well, this is a Johnson and Wales example more than my UNCG, but I teach for the library science program, and I run the library at Johnson Wales in Charlotte, and I can't tell you how many times we teach students how to use databases. We talk about the importance of using good, high-quality sources, and then they're, you know, say in an English class, and then they're in a communications class, and they just totally forget about that, and they just go right to the internet.
Okay, so this whole idea of, hey, we do this very specific way of seeking out information, you meant always, and okay, this one situation class or even this unit or chapter within a single course. And, you know, granted, it can be difficult to tell the difference between this and simple forgetting, right? And you may not be able to do that. But yeah, sometimes I think we are seeing this issue of transfer. And this is a sobering thought, right? If we're teaching these context-specific skills, then really, you know, what are we doing? We have these really high goals in higher learning. We want this stuff to endure forever, and we do want to create good thinkers. So as we'll see in a bit, I don't have any magic bullets to share with you, but we do know some things that make it at least easier or possible to push this pretty heavy boulder up a cognitive hill. So when we think about transfer, all right, so as I said, no magic bullet, but here's something that does seem to help or promote it. Okay, and this will probably be pretty intuitive. Not all that surprising when you think about it. What students need is repeated practice, of course, and probably more practice, honestly, than you think or that you may have built into your course already. So they need repeated practice, but specifically they need practice across varying examples. So this requires us to kind of consider an aspect of problems or scenarios, which I like to call deep structure, kind of underlying structure, and surface structure. So if you think about it, a lot of problems break down pretty neatly into surface details that don't matter and kind of the underlying nuts and bolts that really do matter. Right. So I relate a completely made-up example in Minds Online, but it's one I think that's pretty relatable to most of us, and so here it is. So imagine that you are headed into this lovely green campus. You are 3 miles from the campus. You're headed to a meeting of your space committee, which has always been a boring meeting. You hate it, but this time you might get some good space for your department. So you kind of got to be there. Now, your green Toyota belches a whole bunch of gray smoke, makes a terrible grinding noise, and dies on the side of the road. You got $5 in cash in your pocket, you got a credit card, and a cell phone with 30% battery life, right? So I just threw a whole lot of stuff at you. Okay, so what would you do? It's a problem that you have to solve. What would you do? Any ideas? Call AAA. All right, use that cell phone to call AAA. Any other options you might?
Call to say I'm going to be late for the meeting.
Okay, so you would, call the meeting first. All right, anything else? Right.
Try and start the car again.
Yeah, all right, so maybe the car's not dead after all. Maybe it's okay. Yeah, so some things come to mind, and this seems like a, pretty workable problem for us as experts in adulting, which is the sort of thing that this is. So if you think about that scenario I just threw at you, there's some things that matter about that, and there's some things that don't matter. So first off, what are some things, there's little details about that problem that you think don't matter? Just, put those to the side. Okay, so how much cash I have on me is probably not relevant, okay? What else is maybe not so relevant? What do you think, Denise? What? Okay, the color of the car. Click and clack always ask the color of the car, but yeah, it probably doesn't matter. Anything else that maybe doesn't matter out of that problem? You right away spot it is. What about the color of the smoke?
That does matter.
Okay, it may or may
That'll matter to your mechanic.
It'll matter to the mechanic. It doesn't matter to me because I have no idea,
Right.
but yeah, it might or might not. So the point here is that that's oftentimes how problems are. And when we present them to students, if we say, okay, a researcher is studying 2 brands of Coca-Cola and here's how they're going to study it, and is this a well set up experiment? I can tell what parts of that, doesn't really matter what they're studying, but it matters how they set up the groups. I'm able to kind of drill down and figure out the stuff that does matter. It really does matter how far I am from campus. If I'm 3 miles, it's different than being 300 miles. It doesn't matter if I like that committee or not. That's just a bit of my emotional baggage, but it really does matter that it's important. Maybe I can call them. So that's what experts can do, and that's what I mean by getting at the deep underlying structural problems. And if you think about it, that being broken down next to campus problem is similar, or in a sense even identical, to a lot of other kinds of problems we might encounter, because the deep elements are there. So if I've got a court date and I'm stuck in traffic, if I've got an airplane, you know, I'm trying to make a connection in an airport, that's essentially the same kind of problem, and I have the same kind of options. I can see if I can rearrange the commitment, call ahead. I can see if someone can help me with the transportation and get around it. I can see if I can repair or fix the situation that's delaying me in the first place. So that's what we can do as experts. And to students, though, it all matters, right? If I don't know anything about the scenario, maybe the color of the car is important. Maybe the fact that I hate this meeting is important. That's what can distinguish expert problem solving. And that also becomes important with transfer. So that's how I get good at that stuff, is solving something that's the same kind of problem, but the color of the car and the smoke and whether I like the committee, all that other stuff varies. And when I do that over and over and over, that's how my skills become more general. That's how I can learn how not just to solve, hey, I'm late for my committee meeting, but I've got some kind of a delay or a problem in general. So that's, I think, a useful heuristic for thinking about how we can solve the transfer. Again, it doesn't make it easy for you or the students, but at least it lets you know how to start to build that. Yeah.
Vary the context.
Yes, the context, the surface details.
The ones
Right.
that are not important.
Right, right. So in the case of psychology, where I want my students to learn to distinguish different kinds of ways of setting up studies, for example, I want them to try to do that with studies that involve kids and studies that involve monkeys and studies where we're comparing Coca-Cola and Pepsi. The more times we do that with lots of varied problems, that's how I get good at kind of identifying and working with the underlying mechanics. All right, so that's the good stuff. Now, critical thinking. This has been an area that psychologists we've really kind of taken this to our own and run with it, and we're cranking out some pretty good research on critical thinking. That said, it's really kind of worth a 2-day seminar unto itself, so we're only going to dig into this to a certain extent. But here too, the news is a little bit sobering. So critical thinking, and the first thing to consider with critical thinking is, here again, the definition can really vary across disciplines and contexts. I don't think I've seen two researchers honestly use an identical definition of critical thinking. And I don't think that's terrible. I think that's okay. But we do have to be clear going in, what do we mean by that and what does it look like? Not only so we can assess it and try to develop it in our students, but to know that that's going to be different than your colleague in another discipline or even teaching another course. So being as clear as we can be on what critical thinking means so that we can kind of operationalize it, I think is important. So if you think that there's a ton of different ways of looking at this, it's not you. That's my appraisal of the field too. So let me throw it out to you as well, just so we can have some specifics in mind. What does critical thinking mean or look like to you in your discipline? And here come the catch boxes. So knowing that this is a fairly open-ended type of concept, what does that mean to you, critical thinking? We all want it, but what is it? Woo! Go on.
If I spike it when I'm done.
Yes.
So I teach physics, and one of the problems I run into a lot is students who don't seem to be able to distinguish a rigorous physics-based argument, even a qualitative one, from sort of hand-waving and throwing out the terms. And to me, that's a kind of critical thinking, because it involves looking at an argument and saying, is this rigorous? Is this using the words as they're defined? Are these actually logical implications, or does it just kind of sound scientific?
All right, so one thing leads to another. Terms are used properly, and the conclusions drawn from that make sense given what they've...
Yeah, and given the fact that these have very, very specific technical meanings, as
Okay.
opposed to just communicating a general idea to people.
Okay, all right, and so precision is a big piece of it
Yeah.
as well. All right, so critical thinking in physics, there you have it. Hey.
In cultural studies, critical thinking is it's about questioning assumptions
Okay.
And there's, the contexts are multiple: social, political, philosophical, cultural, etc. And it's examining theories, it's examining practices, it's examining from all those various perspectives, and reflecting as well, so that you are not taking the given as fact, but actually there is an area of education called critical pedagogy, which comes from a philosopher named Paulo Freire, who was teaching illiterates in the field to read, and that way they could question their world. They could not just take what they're told and work with it and that sort of thing.
All right, so rigorous examination and, as you said, questioning of different assumptions, even core ones that come right from our culture. That
Absolutely.
We may not even realize are there.
Especially those.
Especially those. Okay, and here's what it looks like in.
Well, this is more of a question than an answer, but
Yeah.
I was thinking that in anthropology, which it must be in some way the very opposite space from what he was talking about,
Yeah.
I've been wondering about what is critical thinking for a good many years, probably not as long as you have, but I've sort of come to the conclusion that it's like what they talk about in artificial intelligence, of getting the computer to gather enough information that in that very fluid context you have things that you can reference and sort of get an idea, like you read something new and then you have 5 other things that you've read in that category before, and you balance what has been said before with what is there. And I don't know whether that's critical thinking or not, but I'd like to know.
All right.
Which might be what she said.
But it has that underlying quality of rigor and examining things that we normally wouldn't examine, and being really kind of the most difficult or the pinnacle of reasoning in your field.
Yeah, well, that's what bothers me, is I don't
Yeah.
see anything very rigorous in this. It's
Yeah.
on-the-fly evaluation.
Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, this. Here, let's throw the box. There we go.
Well, I work in the social sciences, and I think in the social sciences, one of the things that students have to do is they have to be able to work with evidence and data. And so there's a number of things about that that I think, I think that the issues of logic and the issues of assumptions are clearly things that they have to think about. Is the argument logical, and what are the assumptions that people are making? But I think that they have to be able to basically appraise the evidence. How good is the evidence?
Okay.
I think we think about terms like validity and things like that, and are the conclusions valid from the evidence? And I think another thing that I think that is very valuable is, in the social sciences, a lot of times people don't agree. I just was reading an article where one person said, oh, everything generalizes across 16 different kinds of, it was an article on disability, goes across 16 different kinds of disability. You really ought to think about disability as one big pot. And you have other people who think, oh, well, you can't think about these things as together. You have to think about this kind of disability and that kind of disability and so on. And so people have to be able to try to come to some reconciliation of those kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah. And I gravitate towards that definition as a social scientist as well. It's about evidence, and it's about, and what you said about sources disagreeing, that's a key part of it as well. And it's not the simple matter of just saying, well, there's lots of opinions. Well, there's some opinions are better supported with data than others, and that's what we have to, that's where our discretion comes in as
And
social
I think
scientists.
for me, one of the things that I try to get students to think a great deal about is that we don't have just what I call main effects, just broad general principles, but we have to figure out where A holds and where it doesn't hold.
Yeah, interactions. Oh boy, do we work on those? Do we have another comment from this table?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that I'm a social scientist, but if you look at the evidence, you would also see that mathematicians disagree with each other. Physicists disagree with each other. Biologists disagree with each other. So it's not just us.
All right, well taken. And
I think brings us to one of the key, the word critical and critical thinking is the ability to critically look at a perspective, challenge a point of view or an argument, whether it's my own or somebody else's. That's, I guess to me, that's what the critical part means.
Yeah, I think, absolutely right. Okay, so here again, this is not easy. Yes, do we have another?
I was just going to say,
Please.
just as somebody who consults with faculty and helps faculty, and someone who has suffered as a student a lot of challenges in the past, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, oh my word, what do you really mean by what you're saying? And if I were a student, how am I going to interpret what you're saying and what you really want? And can you walk me through this and examples of this? So we throw out these terms and we think about them and we know what they mean, but undergraduates do not. So that's my 2
Just saying
cents.
that from the student perspective, that's a great point as well. If we can't or shouldn't agree on what critical thinking means, kind of sprinkling that into a syllabus and thinking that's going to result in a particular kind of student work or behavior, it's unlikely. All right, so we have this, and the study of this has listed one barrier after another, or reasons why this is difficult. So let me throw this back to you. What are some of the barriers to developing critical thinking in your course or discipline? Knowing that that is going to look like a lot of different things. What gets in the way? Why doesn't it happen? I mean, the first time I taught Introduction to Psychology, boy, we did critical thinking. We did it in week 2, and there was a whole 4 pages in chapter 2 that was about it. And we covered it, boy, and we did it. And then the next semester when we rolled in a test, an assessment specifically looking at our flavor of critical thinking, that was a rude shock. I said, we had almost a whole week on critical thinking. So I've come to realize some of the challenges and barriers. So what has been your experience? What are some of the barriers? Yep.
Thank you. It takes a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a lot of feedback. And that is really challenging for faculty teaching multiple choice courses.
Yeah. So lots of time, lots of feedback. All right. What else are some of the barriers?
I think sometimes it's a resistance to independent thought. And I had a conference with a student about a paper this semester, a research paper in English, and I gave her some suggestions, and she said, okay, but what do you want me to write? And I said, well, there are different ways you could approach this problem, and set out several different options for her. And she said, but what do you want me to write? So there's also sometimes resistance on the part of students who think that critical thinking means there is one right answer.
Yeah.
And I'm not convinced that critical thinking means there is one right answer in the humanities very often.
I think one problem I see is we don't have enough time. We need to keep going because we have a curriculum to cover, and we don't have enough time to practice.
And what a discrepancy. We say it's so important. We list it first sometimes on our big objectives in the syllabus, and then we run out of time. But that is because, in part, it's inherently complex, and it's also effortful on the part of people doing critical thinking. So what researchers have kind of listed out as the reasons why we don't just all walk around, develop critical thinking in a day and do it perfectly the rest of our lives, is it is hard. It's a little bit like walking on your hands. You can do it with some training, but it's not going to be your first choice. We do tend to default to other means of reasoning and functioning given the option. It's easier, right? So if I open up the paper, I'm scrolling through my feed, and what do you know? I read the study that says that charter school kids are doing better on standardized tests. I may default to, oh hey, there's this charter school down the street and it's great, or my nephew went to one of those and it was not any good. I disagree with that. Or I might just say, well, that proves that there's numbers. the likelihood I'm going to dig in and say, well, you know, how is this study conducted and who are the people walking into the charter schools and opting in the first place, that's a very different story. And as it says here as well, that critical thinking, especially the kind that I'm describing out of the social sciences, is a when to and not just a how to question. It's really a two-layered problem or habit of mind that students have to develop. So it's not just, okay, I know how to deconstruct a causation versus correlation problem, or I know how to lay out an argument using the right terms. I have to know, oh, this is one of those times when it would be good for me to do that and opt into doing that. It's, as we call it, also dispositional. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you're inclined to do it or you're going to choose to do it. And do we have a comment or okay? That's that over there.
No, I was just going to say that it has to matter. I mean, the payout has to be significant to want to be able to take time and you know, most of what we assign students, if it's not personal, if it's not relevant to something personal, is the quality of the decision or quality of the thinking going to matter to them?
Yeah, so setting up situations where it does explicitly matter. So here are some of those kind of top-level general application suggestions. Knowing these couple of key principles about thinking, what we've discovered about this, first off, I think that, if it hasn't come out already, that a really important first step for us as the faculty is to do our own reflection. All right, when we say we want thinking, or better yet, we want critical thinking, what does that mean? What does it look like? Okay, that's a really good thing. And as you might guess, we're going to do a bit of that in our application exercise in a little bit. So reflecting on what students should be able to do. And a lot of people in teaching and learning have made this observation in one form or another, that it's very helpful, instead of to think of, okay, they should know this and they should be familiar with that and be able to describe this thing. What should they be able to do in December that they couldn't do in August? When you think about it in this action-oriented way, that does help to start to reveal the kinds of thinking skills that students want. And then the next really important step is to align the learning activities to that. All right, if you say, I really want students to be able to critically question, you know, this kind of assumption, or I want students to be able to reason from evidence to support one account of human behavior over another, then they need to be spending their time doing that. And a little plug for online courses, because this forces us to rethink. I think this is one of the great things that can happen. You know, no longer is it about, well, they're in a room with me and that's when learning happens. You really have to think, what is the student on the other end of the computer doing with their time? And when you think about what they're doing should really resemble what you want that ideal thinking to be like at the end of the course. And I use critical reading here as an example. If there are kind of sub-skills, things that you have to be able to do in order to be able to do the other stuff. So if we have to be able to critically read a text in order to critically reflect on it, examine it, or weigh it as evidence, well, that's another thing that you may want to reinforce in the course itself. All right. So having students warm up or have some early on assignments where we annotate something together, or it's not about write a paper about this, but really more tell me what you got out of this and how you came to that, picking that out. If it's important, I think that you've got to segregate aside some time for that to happen. All right, so thinking about that, then considering that all-important problem of transfer. If there's something they need to transfer to another situation, if my students are always going to need to be able to tell causation from correlation, I don't want them just to look at that charter school problem. I mean, that's essentially the same as, hey, people who take vitamins are healthier, people who do this or that. So they need to work with lots of examples that vary in the surface structure as much as possible. Now, here's a little odd fact about quizzing and retrieval practice, which, you know, I harped on a lot yesterday. So it turns out this is kind of a twofer. We're finding that quizzing and lots of retrieval practice working with information, it actually complements transfer. So when students perhaps know some foundational information better, that seems to feed into their ability to transfer across problems. We don't quite yet know how it works, but it is something that may work. So that's, you know, something that can be very, very complementary. So lastly, I think in that spirit of if you want them to be able to do it, then they need to be doing it in the course itself. I think that we have great opportunities, especially with online and technology-enhanced learning, to use scenarios and simulations. So I think that's one of the most kind of fun developments and good options across the board that we have. So human beings may be terrible at reasoning and critical thinking, but we're really, really good at play acting and projecting ourselves into situations. And as you'll see in a little bit, students don't need a whole lot of elaborate stage setting in order to simulate or go through some kind of a scenario and practice these skills that we want them to have. So how many people are using any variation on the theme of case studies or problem-based learning or any kind of role-playing? Anybody? All right, anybody care to describe some of their examples of how they're using those? So what are some examples you could throw out? Anybody? All right, let's bring a catch box over. Woo! Catch.
In online learning or in
Oh, and
face-to-
anything, yeah.
Yeah, in my graduate class, I use case studies, sort of Harvard Business School style to get the students to think through an open-ended problem and analyze it together.
Okay.
So, and in the undergraduate courses I teach, I tend to have small mini cases that they write about, and then they share what they found with each other in a post-first type of environment in a discussion. So, what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
Just describing for us what that's like. And what's been your experience with that?
Well, both the graduate students and the undergraduate students love working on case studies. It makes it real for them. It makes it more interesting for them than what they consider a dry textbook. They learn from each other, and they like learning from each other. That's some of it.
So they also find it very motivating, it sounds like, right?
Yes.
Right. So we don't have to push them into doing it a lot of the time, right? Other examples? Yes?
I teach an online class that's kind of instructing people about global awareness through tourism. And the project I came up with, we had a group of staff members that agreed to be clients, and I developed profiles of the clients through a survey and then posted these to student groups online. And their job was to go through the client profile. It was kind of complex because they answered a lot of questions about themselves. And so the students were assigned to develop proposed trip itineraries for their client. And so they were able to use the profile information to try to come up with targeted trip itineraries, kind of like a Rick Steves, you know, for that particular client. So, yeah.
Well, I teach library administration and management for UNCG, and we use case studies quite a bit from Library Journal, and students love it because a lot of times we're talking about management theory, and they're not as excited about that. But then when they get to hear about sort of real problems and issues in libraries and different types of library settings, and then share what their thoughts are and realize the thing I find exciting about it is a lot of them do have library experience, but some of them come to it, as a second career, and they realize all of a sudden that the experience that they have, they do realize that they have some transferable skills into problem solving in the library situation. And sometimes it's a matter of getting them to see that too. That comes out of the case studies.
I teach a course in human development, and it's theories of human developments. And so I have these cases basically for several of the different theories. And I think that it helps students, they find theories kind of abstract, and they wonder why we're learning them and so on. But then when they get into these cases, they can see how they can apply the concepts of the theory. And I think that I sort of set up the cases so that they kind of call for applying a particular theory, and I do that multiple times throughout the course. And then at the end of the course, I have about a third of my final exam is a little more complex case where they have to bring in different theoretical perspectives. And I think it's a good package.
Because it kind of scaffolds or leads up to a higher stakes example of the same exact kind of thinking that they've been doing all along. So yeah, if that doesn't come across as well, that this is going to be more effective when it's not a one-off, the way that I kind of used case studies when I used them early on, that's good. So, I mean, we think about these, we think of the fun factor. And that's definitely coming up, and that's really important. But there's a cognitive side to this as well, a real cognitive argument to be made for having all kinds of simulations and scenarios in our courses wherever possible. And that's where I want to flow into a couple of more detailed examples. Now, these are not high-tech tech. I would say that I'll show you some that are, I would call medium tech, and then some really low-tech tech. So things that all you really need is email, in one case, as you'll see, to set up something that can produce pretty sophisticated outcomes and thinking on the part of the student. So what does it all look like? I think that in the case of very targeted, the medium tech to high tech simulations that are out there, a lot of these are discipline specific. So definitely work with the library, work with other people in your discipline to find things that are geared and tailored to do and reinforce certain specific things. I think that sometimes we have intrepid souls who'll try to build some of these from the ground up, and when you're doing that's complicated. So you may want to look for what's out there instead of building. But some examples that I love from within my discipline. First off, Sniffy the rat. Now, the Sniffy's been around for a long time. He even has a whole subgenre of YouTube videos now. He's really gone Web 2.0. So what Sniffy is he's an animated virtual rat, and that has a fun factor as well. But what he does is he responds to stimuli that you might use to, we'd call it training him. And he kind of does this on the same time frame as an actual rat. So it's not Halo here. This is it takes a long time to get him to do something. But you can do things like dispense food out of that little food hopper. You can see if you can train him to respond to a light that comes before the food. And when I was a psychology undergraduate major, we had to maintain rat labs that smelled bad, and the rats bit you, and all this bad stuff happened. And now we can have that same really hands-on experience with learning principles with this simulation. And this connects in particular, it solves a particular problem if you're teaching learning theory, which is so important. But I mean, if you remember back to your intro to psych text, it's that chapter where they start talking unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus, and your eyes cross and you don't know what's going on anymore. You really do need to work with that stuff to bring it alive in any way. And he's better than a real rat in that you can rerun the simulation as many times as you want. It also now has what's called a mind window. It shows you kind of theoretically what's going on in Sniffy's little mind and brain while he's showing different behaviors. So that's what it looks like in your learning or intro to psych class. Cog Lab, which I just kind of have a little graphic here what the page looks like, the front page of it looks like. This was developed by faculty for faculty a long time ago, and now it's been taken on by a publisher, and it's got more sophisticated graphics and implementation. But it solves a problem for me as a cognitive psychologist, because our stuff is built on these studies which, you know, to me as an expert, they're so fascinating, they're set up so cleverly, but to the novice student, they're trying to read through it and they're going, okay, so you're timing people, they're reading letters, the letters are blue, and then you're telling them to say the word red, and here's the millisecond time. It's just really, really confusing. But if you sit somebody down in front of the classic Stroop effect, where you read the words that are in a different colored ink, you gotta go, oh, okay, now I know what's going on. So this offers you the ability to simulate a lot of very classic experimental paradigms at home from the participant's perspective. So it kind of maps onto what students are reading about. Plus, if you want, you can have them actually work with the numbers. So everybody in the class can do one of these things at home, and then you put those data out to the class and say, okay, let's interpret these. What does this mean? Did this replicate what Stroop originally found, or did we not replicate it? And like other good simulations, it's also not a one-off. I mean, I could sit and try to put together a kludged together demonstration for any one of these things. But it's something that students can see varied across paradigm after paradigm to see what they have in common as well. So interactive simulations of physics and chemistry. My intrepid colleague Larry McPhee at our e-learning center actually teaches a Bio 100 lab course completely online, and one of the things he really depends on these simulations for is to bring students up to speed if they're a little shaky on chemistry, which they're going to need, just the parts that they're going to need for the biology they do later on. And so when you can manipulate these things, I mean, you can't even really see molecules in real life, but a simulation allows you to do that. So very discipline-specific targeted simulations, especially those that are interactive, repeatable, versatile, and target very specific problems or concepts that students have trouble with, those are real gold when we can incorporate them. Now, moving into the low-tech stuff that we can create on our own with a little bit of creativity. So I would even call it a simulation or a case study type of thing when you have students doing something like practical application. So one of the things that we, our big epiphanies when we redesigned our Introduction to Psychology course years ago, exactly around this issue. We said, oh wow, we want all this reasoning, and one of the things we also wanted students to be able to do is apply all this stuff they learned to really everyday situations. I mean, this is intro psych. It may be the last psych course they ever take, but we really wanted them to be able to flow that out into how they raise their kids and the decisions they make politically and how they look at their other courses. So we wanted it, and we realized we had absolutely nothing in the course in any systematic way that required students to do that. So we put together these real-world scenarios that had some kind of a little work product, which we didn't ever grade for format or style or anything like that. We just really wanted students to treat it realistically. And they were things like this. Write about a 2-minute speech for your school board that argues for or against a program of bilingualism. That's a very, very hot issue in Arizona where I live. Or write a memo to the person you work for on campus saying whether you should spend $10,000 on this new fancy program that claims to expand your working memory. And we tell them a little bit about this program and say, okay. Now, and we did tell them also, we want to see you using the concepts from the textbook. Those should make an appearance somewhere in what you say. And then this one, which students absolutely went nuts over this one last one. We never anticipated this, but this one also relates to that deadly dull learning chapter. And the scenario had to do with your new puppy, Fluffy. And Fluffy's eating the living room furniture again, and your roommates have had it. So you got to find a new home for Fluffy. And you have to write an email to your roommates explaining how you're going to address this behavior. and using concepts from the chapter. And students would be absolutely adamant that none of this was Fluffy's fault, and you needed to, substitute in some other responses and look at kind of some species-specific behaviors that are very hard to train out of an animal. So that's one that students could really project into. And so that was at least a beginning of our having students do this in the class with a brief writing assignment that all it takes is a writing prompt. Works online or blended or face-to-face. And here's a favorite that, with permission, I love to tell people about this one. It's invented by Rebecca Mystere, whose colleague I met at SUNY Oswego, and they have a fantastic teaching and learning office, and they do really, really great work. So can't say enough about those guys. But I learned about this when I was visiting them on a workshop much like this one. Now, Rebecca Mystere is, her background is art and design, but she also teaches us for the web. So how to design websites that are not just nice looking for your clients, but also serve some business purposes. So she related this assignment that she had put together for this. It's one piece of a very big class, but it really caught my attention. You'll see why in a second. So in this class, Web Media 1, students need to develop, of course, these web skills, but they also really need to develop client responsiveness, right? The ability to kind of communicate with a given client. Now, one of the assignments in the class, pretty traditional case study type of assignment, is every student gets an assignment where they have a client, and the client has certain requirements. It might be a profit or a nonprofit, and here's what they want in their site. You make your site around that pretend client. But here's the twist, is that these clients didn't just have requirements. They had personas. And one touch of realism really brought this to life. She set up an email address for each client, and you had to communicate with your client through this email. And she would respond on the other end with that client's sort of persona. And sometimes your clients tell you things that make sense, and sometimes they sort of obfuscate. They say one thing and they really want another. And students were amazingly able to project into this. She told me that she managed this. She actually had pictures up on her board of sort of these little faces of all of her pretend clients, so she would kind of know who is who. And I loved it because she once told me, she said, well, occasionally, every once in a blue moon, the students will come into my office and be like, oh, I cannot believe my client is being so totally unreasonable, and they said this and I can't believe it. And she would have to remind them that, that's me. So why is this a good simulation? It's not just the realism, it's got that piece of it's repeatable, okay? So if the communication just went totally off the rails, she could write back to the student and say, okay, we're gonna try that again. This is me writing to you as me now. Try it again, and we'll see if we can get it back on track. So even something like that, using nothing but email, can be a great and really realistic simulation. Okay. Now, I'm going to make a little assignment to you. We're going to work through a problem here. And as always is my MO, I'll tell you more about why and what in a minute. Won't take too long. So what I'd like for everybody to do, just to try to introspect for a second on what this is like, I'm going to assign this reasoning task to you, okay? So your reasoning task is something that we call rule verification. Now, those of you from some intensive mathematics background, philosophy, logic, you guys just have to kind of play along, all right? So bear with me if that describes you. Hold your thoughts for a minute, because you'll see what's going on here. But for the rest of us, what I want you to do is think about this rule. If a card has an odd number on one side, it has an animal on the other side. And we're going to use our imaginations a little bit here and picture these rectangles as cards. Imagine those are cards, are spread out on the table in front of you. Your job is to say, well, what information would help me know if this rule is being followed or whether it's being broken, okay? And all you can do is flip the cards. Now, the catch here is you have to figure out, you can't just flip all the cards and look at it then. You have to say, all right, which cards would be helpful and which cards would not be helpful in verifying this rule. All right, so if this rule is being followed or not. So let you ponder that for a minute. If a card has an odd number on one side, it has an animal on the other side, if you're from math, if you're from philosophy, you gotta just kind of put a sock in it. But, all right, so which cards?
Verify it's being followed.
Or if it's followed or broken, yeah. So which cards would be helpful to say this rule is either true or false? Yeah. All right. So it's
Tell me what you want. No, I'm just
okay. Yeah, stuff, isn't it? Just tell me what you want me to say.
Tell me what you want.
Okay. So we've got card 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. So 1, how do we feel about 1? Yeah, that would be good because we could flip it over, and you know, if it doesn't have an animal on the other side, then wow, hey, that rule's not being followed. How do we feel about card number 2? Probably not. Card number 3? We liked card number 3, and card number 4. You don't like that one. Okay. Yeah. So, and we could even get fancy here, and we could even try to flip these over. I'm not sure if we can. Okay, that's all right. So let's think for a second about whether these rules are useful or not. So if we flip that one over, yeah, if it doesn't have an animal on the other side, yeah, wow, that was super helpful to do. We flip over the 2 and it has a duck on the other side. It's got an even number and has an animal. Does that show us our rule is being broken? No? No? Yes, some people say yes, some people say no. Okay. We flip over an animal and it's got an even number. Is that helpful? Okay, some people say yes, some people say no. And we flip over our non-animal and it's got an odd number. Okay, now we know the rule's being broken. Yes, is all that just crystal clear to you? No. Okay, so, all right, that's all right because we're going to try another rule. Okay, or we're going to totally fall out of our presentation. So, yeah, let's start. Okay, full screen. Is that what we want to do? Ah, okay. Okay, so we're going to try another rule. So we'll give you another crack at this. So here's the rule. Once again, we're picturing some cards, but this time our cards represent people. And the rule is if a person is drinking alcohol, that person is over 21 years of age. All right, and we can grapple with that rule. So on our cards, we have ages, we have beverages. Which cards would be useful to flip over? So who do you check? Okay, all right. So do we want to check this card, the beer card? All right, so if we flip over beer and there's 17, oh my gosh, rule is being broken, big time. What about the juice? Do we check the person who's drinking juice? Right, because they can be any age, doesn't matter. What about the person we know is 30? Do we check their beverage? No. And the person who's 19? Check them, okay. Wow, all right, did we feel slightly more confident with the second rule than the first rule? Okay, and this was probably not just a practice effect. And the gimmick here, which you'll see straight through if you're familiar with this kind of form of logic or math, is that these are exactly the same problem. Those rules are set up exactly the same way. So in both cases, cards number 1 and cards number 4 are the only ones you can flip over. Most people will go for card number 3 in the first rule. And we have this great feeling that that will be helpful, but it's really more helpful than checking a 30-year-old to see if they have an alcoholic beverage. It won't tell you one thing or another. So most of us find that first rule is dizzying, disorienting, and confusing, and we can't think about it the right way. The second one is easier.
But
Yeah?
For the first one, we use numbers too
Mm-hmm.
on the top, so that's confusing.
Okay, so you found the numbers and what are...
Numbers and the numbers in the card.
Okay, all right. I mean, we have a number here, more or less arbitrary number, but it's a little bit different.
but the rule is not. You say age 30.
Okay, age 30.
You know what I mean?
Okay, on the card itself, right? So if I just put 30, it might be a little bit easier. What else do you think is?
No, it's not what I mean.
Okay, go ahead.
If you go to the first rule,
Mm-hmm. Back all the way up.
if you go to the first rule, you
Okay.
say if a car has an odd number on one side,
Uh-huh.
but the number, but you are numbering the cars with number.
Ah,
Car
okay.
number 1, car number 2, car.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Okay, all right, so there's conflicting information in a way?
Yes.
Okay,
So if you
all
say
right.
A, B, C, D options
Okay.
instead of 1, 2, 3, 4.
We could try, yeah, we could try that different way. What do you think about the difference in difficulty that most people very normally will perceive between these?
The second one, we have a context to put it in.
Yeah,
We know about that from either when we were
Yeah.
under 21
Yeah.
or when our kids were under 21.
okay, all right, so familiarity with the rule, right? So a familiar context, and she can probably guess that's exactly where, you know, we're going with this. There's a lot of things about this that are also, they're arbitrary and confusing, including the numbering of the cards. But one of the things that some research on this has shown that really matters is context, and not just that specific rule. It probably does help that we're familiar with the alcohol in 21 rule specifically. But some researchers have argued, I think with a pretty clever series of studies, that it's having that general kind of schema or scenario in mind, that framework. They call it a permission schema. So once you're also able to produce this suddenly better reasoning, if you use a rule that people aren't familiar with that specific rule, but that kind of rule. So for example, if a letter is going abroad, it has to be sealed. If it's domestic, it can't be sealed. You can give people a rule that they have never seen before, but once you phrase it in that way, that in order to do this, you have to meet this criterion, suddenly it clicks. So not even specific memories of a rule can help you, but having a context and a general understandable context to put it in, all of a sudden, same brain, same person, 2 minutes apart, you can reason dramatically differently. What do you think?
So if you were teaching this, trying to help students with this,
Yeah.
would you flip the examples?
Okay. Well, if I were trying to teach them about rule verification specifically, I would probably, I'd probably start with the easier one and work up to the more confusing one. But what this really is a variation, just like with the penny, on a classic experimental paradigm called the Wasson card sorting task. And it was developed to do some very different things in research paradigms. But I really like to adapt it for this type of thing to show how reasoning can feel very differently once you do kind of pull the rug out from somebody, have them trying to flounder around with no context whatsoever, versus something that they know. So I like it really more as an empathy exercise more than something that I would use with students specifically.
Yeah.
I like it because it really shows you, hey, this is what it feels like to be a smart person who knows all about logic and be trying to grapple with something when you have very, very little to hold on to. Yes? Oh, no, didn't. Oh, sorry. Okay. Other reflections on this. So that's what this can, I think, tell us about reasoning. And, you know, researchers use this for other purposes. But did we all kind of feel that context effect happening in our heads as we tried to do this? Same rule, same brain, two different contexts, two different things. So with that hopefully more empathic understanding of what our novice learners are in for, let's go ahead and flow into our application exercise, which is similar to, not identical to, the one we did yesterday. So this is going to work off, once again, some sheets that should be in your binders. So if you'll find the worksheet titled Part 2A. If you'd like, you can kind of refresh on some of the resources or that website I put together, see if anything really grabs your fancy, or you can dive right into this part. So just like yesterday, I would like for people to think about a teaching challenge, either a concept, a skill that students struggle with, bless you, or something more global, anything you could wave that wand and say, I wish I could fix this one thing. It can be the same as yesterday's teaching challenge, or you can pick a brand new one. It'll work either way. And then I would like us to, once again, articulate some kind of a strategy, an idea for targeting that challenge. But here's the extra step that I built in. Now, remembering that with thinking skills, especially critical thinking, defining what you're looking for, defining what you mean is a big piece of it. I want us to do a little bit of that as an intermediate step as well. So I've suggested kind of formulating it this way. What's the gap, right? What can students do right now? What can they not do? What can they not do that you want them to be able to do, all right? So my students can't, say, critically read. That's what I want. What can they do right now? Defining what that gap is, all right? So we're going to reflect on the teaching challenge, possible solutions, and in the middle of it, what is that gap between what you want students to be able to do and what they can do. All right, we're going to work on this until 10:35, so we'll give it 30 minutes. We're not going to share it with sticky paper today. We had some non-sticky sticky paper, and I think for many of us, we were more interested in the conversation we were having, and that's good. So just as before, I'll circulate around and see what you're coming up with. All right. So I heard a range of challenging problems and difficult concepts, and that's fine. This is higher learning after all, and that's what we want. So what were some insights that you would like to share with some of the other tables? So what came out of it? Yes? Oh,
Okay. Go ahead.
Go
Why
for
don't
it.
you talk? Go ahead.
I think it was very interesting, and she can tell us more about that, how since they are kids, our students are kids, they have been kind of trained not to think critically, like in the schools and in general the system.
All right.
She can tell more about
Yeah,
that.
so really active discouragement from practicing the things that you want them to have.
Right. Well, we were just having a more informal discussion around this activity, and we were talking about that from very early ages, and you chimed in a lot on this, so speak as well. But that, you know, they're not children from very young ages are not necessarily encouraged to think independently, and you know, we start children in schooling so very young, and you compare this to some other countries like Finland, and it's a totally different way of looking at education, and they rank far higher than we do. But the point is that when they go through K-12 in this way, especially with this more concrete approach to learning that I also think is kind of a, you know, a business model, more or less, that, you know, they miss out on the more developmental, enriching process of learning, which speaks to independent thinking and being able to use those higher Bloom's taxonomy skills and that sort of thing. And I'll let you go.
Yeah.
Well, you said it. We're good. You know, they're just, they're, you know, we teach them sit down and shut up and listen to the teacher for 13 years, and then they get here and we expect them to understand how to talk to us. But they've just been told to be quiet and listen and be spoon-fed information. So
Exactly.
we need to start it earlier. We need to start in kindergarten teaching them to think critically if that's something that as a society we feel is important that our children know how to do, instead of trying to teach it to them after they're already, you know, where they are now.
And that's the buzzword. If we as a society think it's important, and apparently we don't think it's that important.
Well, I
don't
don't know that it's that people don't think it's important. I think it's complacency, and that people don't even think that they're not thinking. So they, you know, they don't even recognize that they are just going through life on autopilot.
For the media influence too.
Yeah, we did talk about media influence as well.
So sort of reforming, I mean, yeah, I definitely hear you and agree on reforming everything from pre-K on up. What are some things we can do in the here and now, given that that's the situation, that not only have we not practiced, not only is it inherently difficult, but maybe we have been actively told that's not the way to do this and been discouraged. What are some things we can start to do in our courses right now to address that?
In our courses?
Yes, in our courses. What could we do? What actions could we take?
Well, what we had talked about is, remind me your name again. Cheryl. Cheryl and I had talked about in our classes, like I'm a comm studies teacher, and in my classes I tell them question everything, and that's the way that I view critical thinking, is questioning. And so to me, teaching them to question everything is the first step. And I say, you know, if you hear me, don't just take what I say on face value. Listen to what I'm saying and evaluate it and question, is that right? Does that make sense? Question what you're hearing in the media. Question what your friends are saying to you. Question what you see on Facebook. And so I'm always telling my students, question what information you have coming in, and then I'm hoping that that's a good way to start.
And it puts you on the spot just a little bit. Do you catch them in the act of doing that during the course? Are there times when you observe that, or are there more formal opportunities where you say, I want you to question everything, now go and do it, and I'll give you some feedback? How does that play out once you've told them that?
Well, I do have people who question, but I think that those people are just people like me that would question anyway, because I always have questions. I don't see it a whole lot. Where I see it is in my children, and I want to smack them sometimes because I taught them to question everything, and so now they question me constantly. So, you know, that's not, but those are people I live with. That's not somebody I'm with for 3 months and then I move on. You know, you have a great point, though, that maybe I could make it an activity where, and maybe I make it an activity that I do a couple of times a semester where I say, here it is, question it. Think of all the questions that you can that have to do around with whatever this case study or whatever it is may be. So yeah, maybe I would make that an activity to see if I can push the issue a little bit.
Okay. No answers allowed, only questions. Yeah, what do you think?
I think
I got it.
Business I always call it intro to computers, but it's not here. It's, you know, it's business computing, and I've been teaching computer courses for a long time, since last century, from, you know, adults in businesses, now in higher ed, also in high schools and things like that. And the difference, you know, as far as teaching a group of adults, they ask questions they want to know because it's their job. They have, you know, they're here, they have to know it. Versus when I came into higher ed and I walked into these computer classrooms and you could hear a pen drop. And it finally took me a while, but I realized, you know, this generation, there's this expectation that they know everything about computers, and I'm here to tell you, they do not. They can do this really well, but they cannot do this. And I've been teaching now since, as students, non-working students, you know, all this century, and it's just shocking to me. So one of the things that I've really tried hard to do is create this safe environment for them so that they will talk. And the other thing is I break them up into study groups, and I make them work with their study groups, because I am not going to be their go-to. I refuse to. I won't troubleshoot their work. They have to figure it out. They can come ask me and I'll point them, but I make them work in study groups, and it's really changed the dynamic of my class, because now they walk in the classroom and they know somebody. You know, there's somebody in there that they know. And so I've seen their grades improve. The groups that do get together and actually do the work. But I think the most important thing that I've done is try to create a safe environment so that when somebody does ask me a question, you know, thank you, that's a good question. I do tell them, you know, there may not be any stupid questions, but there's a lot of lazy questions, you know, and I think that's the most important thing, is just letting them know it's safe to ask questions. It's safe. It's okay to talk. It's, you know, because I don't think they don't get that. Like you guys said, they don't get that at all, and so they're so afraid to come and talk to me about. But they'll send me an email.
But they will send you an email. And, you know, so we can be novice enough to where we can't even formulate a question. I feel that way a lot of the time myself. And that could work well in online too. And I like that you've kind of made a procedure for asking a question. You know, their default is to send you what may be an overly general email, but you're saying, okay, step one, go to this person, this person, and this person.
You have to first contact them.
Yeah, and I don't know, because I don't work in that kind of environment, but I think that a lot of contemporary, you know, more corporate environments, that's what you do. You do not email whoever the CEO is and say, hey, how do I log in? or you shouldn't, you should go to the people in your working group. So
Yeah.
modeling that and saying, okay, time and again, I want to see you following this particular procedure for question and answer can help address
Yeah.
that. All
Yeah.
right.
I was to say, speaking of email, I mean, I average 150 emails a day.
Yeah.
On it because they have so many. I have a very, very strict email policy. It's a very formal, professional email policy. It's outlined in my syllabus, and if they don't follow it, if they miss one thing on it, I send it back to them. Please see the syllabus for proper email format. Even if it's like, I'm in a car wreck and I'm bleeding about, it's like, I send it back. Please see the, because they have to know. It's not, they can't text me.
Yeah.
I'm their boss. They can't text. They can't write to me like that.
So you're kind of using an analogy too, saying, look at me like your boss. And that's not appropriate for every class, but in your class, it really is.
I do, I do that a lot. I'm your boss and I'm training you for this job. Some of you are going to get it and some of you aren't.
Yeah, and it's funny, we implemented an email policy in that giant Psych 101 course too. That was one of the things we did, just again, out of just sheer overwhelm, but it had a lot of side benefits too, which were totally unanticipated. So we also set some policies, and we didn't just not answer them. We said we'll deduct a point, and I was at 1,000 points. We said we'll deduct a point if you send us anything that doesn't tell me who you are, that's just like, hey, dude, and 18 exclamation points as the subject line. We need to see, it needs to say, and we said very specifically, here's how you say it, because there was like, it can't be assumed knowledge. We said, okay, dear Professor blah, my name is blah, and here's my question. And it has to have a significant, thank you very much, comma, blah.
And your name.
And there's your name. And we held that thread over their heads. Our graduate students, we said, okay, do you think you could track this policy? We're gonna, deduct a point. And they said, oh, we would do that on our own time for free. We are really tired of, hey, when's the final exam? And that's what triggered it. So we had something like 50 emails, when's the final exam? It's like, it's on the front page of the syllabus. So if you email us about something that is in the syllabus, that's a point. And I say this had unanticipated benefits. I was sitting with our anthropology faculty once and telling them about this, and you should do this in your classes. And they said, oh, that explains this weird thing that happened. All of a sudden, one semester, the emails we were getting from our students all of a sudden were properly spelled, had subject lines, a salutation, and we didn't know what was going on. So what do you know? They learn it in your class. Transfer if you do it enough times, right? Exactly. Transfer. It's not easy if you just sort of tell them, but you actually have to do this. Then voila, I know how to email a professor. All right, good stuff. Yes?
Well, I wanted to talk about the question.
Yeah, the questioning everything.
Because what we do, the course I teach two, one called What Can I Do for Life, the other one is called Redesign Elective Life. So it's putting into practice stuff.
Yeah.
So if you're doing practice, we actually have a little half sheet. And we have them, so this is what you're going to do this week, and we actually have them documented on a little half sheet. Because we found that if they write it down and we put it, if they write it down, they're more likely to do it than if we just have them do it and do it in your head. So we have them document. So you could say question, every day this week you're going to have this question and ask it to someone. And they do that every day for a week and they document it. Little half sheet of paper, but you'd be amazed. So we're trying to do it in terms of incorporating daily practices like mindfulness and movement and things that actually help your life. But you could easily adapt it to other things as well.
Right.
So, but do it and have them document it, because that way it's clear to them what they need to do.
And you've got that routine of every week.
Right.
And this picks up on a kind of a running theme that I heard in some different discussions of, hey, I have this great thing, I do it once. We do it at the end, we do it at the beginning. Well, if it is a great thing and it really, you do feel it's targeting some really good, underlying good stuff like that, like question everything or, ask a question about your life, then let's build it in low stakes throughout the semester. Does it create a pile of grading? It doesn't have to. I think that too is a type of small stakes thing. Hey, trade it with your friend, check each other off at the beginning, first 5 minutes of class. So that type of thing.
We do it as a 7-day challenge, once a week.
7-day challenge.
So just do it for 7 days, because you could try anything for a week.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Every day for a week, for 1 week. That's it.
All right, and that has a kind of a familiar frame that I could fit that in. If you said, well, this is a daily practice, this, that, I might be confused if you say 7-day challenge, all right? That now I know what this is going to be like. All right. Do you have any other insights that we would like to share, things that floated up out of our discussions? All right. Good. Yeah. Catch.
You do it.
Woo!
All three of us ended up agreeing about the same general thing, which is that it's math, right?
Yeah.
All have the experience
Yeah.
that our students
Yeah.
who may do perfectly fine in math courses come into our worlds, and then as soon as they see a symbol or a plus sign or a variable or something like that, they basically freeze. In physics, I found that students may do perfectly well in their calculus classes, but to them it's just rules and symbols. When I try and use math to talk about physics ideas, it's like I'm trying to talk about the subtleties of constitutional law in French, and they're worrying about what is a verb and what's a noun. And they
Yeah.
can do that, but they can't listen to what's being said. And that strikes me as a humongous problem of transfer. Which makes me think we really need a course in quantitative reasoning at this university that's not just math skills.
Well, yeah, and just-in-time help, and that is one I think you've really identified. I'll just be blunt. I'll call it solving a problem through prerequisites. And we're struggling with that in psychology too. We've said, we get students in statistics who literally cannot manage fractions, and so the solution supposedly was let's up the requirements. And yeah, on paper they've got this A and they can't do a fraction. What gives?
Because having a context gave it meaning, and having a meaning let me learn it. Differently than just learning a bunch of rules. So pushing things off to prerequisites may actually be a bad idea. If you're making them learn it in a place that doesn't have the context they're going to need it for with you.
I'll just be overshare and say it's not working. It is not working in psychology. I've heard this in chemistry as well. I've heard it from computer science. There's certain concepts we really need them to be able to implement, and I'm looking at a transcript that's got A after A after A in advanced mathematics, and it's not happening. So I think that's sort of a big cross-disciplinary, cross-curriculum problem that I don't know. I'm going to have my eyes open for solutions to it. But yeah, application, contextual math, whatever you want to call it, you are definitely not alone. That's a big issue for many of us. All right, so I'm glad that one came out as well. I wish I did have even the beginnings of a solution, but that is a very tough one. Woo! Touchdown. All right, so we're gonna. That's a great point to head into this next big truth about what I've learned through doing this work.